Welcome back to our SBL Preseen analysis. Now, let's start by looking at the industry itself. For the first paragraph, the organizations in the industry manufacture adult and children's shoes in factories or smaller workshops. Now, what I'm very interested in is related to the organizational structure itself, because from the first Preseen that this topic has never come up. So I would expect a similar questions to come up. Now, referring back to a real life case, it's called the Clark's shoes. I'm sure that many of you have seen this brand before. It actually used the matrix structure to deal with the inflexibility problem. Now, how it works is that the retail function will work with a regional manager to deal with the promotions in store and stock allocations to make sure that we are not overstocking the shoes or having not enough shoes to sell, and even staffing issues. Now, of course, currently in our business, Dearn company, that we are operating the functional structure, and we'll see in a second, is the top-down functional structure. There will certainly be some problems coming in, as we can see from the Preseen as clues like the product recalls and also the quality issues. So we may be thinking about to switch from the functional to the matrix structure on the exam day. So if I were you, I would like to quote the pros and cons of the matrix structure, okay, to solve this problem. So, of course, the advantage of a matrix structure will be more adaptable to the local market needs. However, the downside of that will certainly be the dual command, which means a waste of time. Of course, when I'm going through the Preseen material, I'm also touching on the syllabus area, and this area is from the syllabus area from SBL H1A. It's all about the organizational structure issues. So make sure that we are ready for that. Now, apart from this, I'll also expect my students to understand the internal relationships by referring back to Mingsberg theory, okay, to talk about how can we manage the organization quite well, okay, using different ways. So, for example, direct supervision or manual adjustment approach. Now, moving on then, I would say that in the next paragraph, we're told that shoes are traditionally made from leather, but a variety of cheaper man-made materials have been developed. Okay, so for example, things like the plastic, for example, using PVC. And those materials include synthetic leather, which is made from a fabric base covered in plastic. Now, what I would think about the issue related to the man-made materials would be this. I can refer to the SBL syllabus areas related to the value chain, related to the inbound logistics according to the Porter's value chain analysis. Now, I would say that using plastic, for example, they are lighter. They're easier to store, of course. And certainly the implications to our business will be to reducing costs in storing those items. At the same time, we can use mass production with machines to produce the shoes, and that will certainly lower down our costs. However, if your cost is quite low, how can you support the premium pricing? That would be a question mark. And even that you can think about the longer term effect that may be eroding your brand equity. So this will be, I would say that is the Z step. I mean, when I teach my students of how to structure their answer in the exam, I'll always use the XYZ relationship. Showing these details in the exam would certainly help. Now, switching towards the man-made materials, another implication I can refer back to the syllabus. It's all about the D1C, the key risk in there. And in particular, we are talking about the environmental and reputation risk. So for example, that using plastic, increasing the environmental footprint. I'm not saying that using the man-made materials will be rubbish. I'm saying that you will need to have certain ways in order that you are not damaging your brand from the environmental point of view. So for example, have you got ways to recycle your shoes, your materials? I mean, if this is not the case, that certainly be a key factor that increasing your reputation risk, okay, later on. And of course, we can also think about related to the CSR stuff. Being a corporate citizenship will be the right to our business. However, we'll need to have the responsibility as the obligation for this. So that's why we'll need to think about the CSR issue. Now, for the CSR issue, what we would think about is the ethical sourcing. So whenever that you buy materials from your supplier, you always need to think about, is it fair in terms of prices that you pay for? Okay, at the same time, you also need to think about the impact onto the environment. So I would suggest our business would do is that instead of using sort of like the not environmentally friendly materials, but I would highly recommend you to remember such keywords such as recycled materials, plant-based materials, and biodegradable materials. I mean, these will be examples that demonstrating your insight related to ethical sourcing. Right, now, I would say that a famous example for this is called the company called Forever 21. It was collapsed, but subsequently bought by another company. Now, why it collapsed was because it was heavily using the polyester, PU leather, and PVC materials before to save costs, to increase margin. However, the downside of that would be it has been perceived as the throwaway fashion, which means the one-off fashion, which means that I can buy your shoes, but it will not last quite long. At the same time, it's not good for the environment. So this is why between 2017 to 2019, public criticism saying that this business was not sustainable. At the same time, it has no recycling plans in its company, and finally it failed. It filed for bankruptcy. But of course, back in 2020, it was bought by another company later on, but it still survives nowadays. So I would say that from this example, we can see that the materials here, for example, the cheaper man-made materials, we know that on the surface that it will reduce costs. But remember, this paper is called Strategic Business Leader, which means that you will need to think in a strategic way, which means you need to think in a Z way, which means you need to think what will be the impact onto the future. So you need to do the right thing. This is what I mean by leader. So this is why you will always need to think about, in the longer term, impact on your brand. Moving on then, next paragraph. We're told in our country it's called Luckland. The revenue was $37.50 million and the growth 1.71. But expecting the next 5 years to be 1.06 per. This means that slower growth in the market. So at the same time, we're told that dominated by 5 organisations. For example, the Flamingo, the Wriggle, the Parish, and our company here. And of course, the Better Buy company. All right. I would say that we've got total of 45% of the share, but over 200 smaller organisations holding another 55%. Now, the implication to us, firstly, I would say that this is quite a mature market. The reason is there'll be slower growth. All right, that will be a starting point. At the same time, when I analyse the competition in this market, I would classify that it would be in an oligopoly market. But you don't really have to remember that name. But what I'm going to be doing is that in the oligopoly market, the best solution would not to reduce our selling price. That would be a foolish idea unless we are not able to keep up with the prices. Now, the best ways that we can do in the oligopoly market to compete with other competitors would certainly be, firstly, we will differentiate ourselves, perhaps branding ourselves as a sustainable business, that we are quite quick to the market and our design is quite good. For example, think about differentiation that works, but this is not enough. The reason is that because we are competing with another 4 major players in this market. So this is why my approach would certainly be to protect the market share. Now, what do I mean by market share is our revenue. We need to make sure that our revenue will not be stolen by another major competitor. Now, in order that we protect our market share, of course, at the same time protecting our margin, which means keeping our price stable, but increasing the sales volume, at the same time reducing our costs. So do make sure that we need to think about ways to reduce our costs to be more efficient. But at the same time, how to increase the volume? Well, to differentiate ourselves. Now, what I would suggest the Dearn company would do, by referring back to real life cases, so for example, what Class has been doing is that, well, it has exported products to, customers in another country. And at the same time, Class has been partnering with the local logistics. For example, the Class, operating its business in China and partnering with the local Chinese companies in logistics. At the same time, to adjust and to adapt the standard size of their shoes and to be more adaptable to the Chinese customers, for example. So of course, when we are thinking about to export our products later on, yes, we can think about how Class has been doing. Adaptation will be the very key there. Now, another famous brand is from France. It's called Wedger. Now, Wedger, what it did is that it makes sure that it sells higher margin shoes. Now, what it did is that it will find a particular segment, not a quite large segment, because the shoes are relatively pricey, relatively expensive. But what it did is that it will make sure it will use wild rubber and organic materials, and to make sure the sourcing of these materials are absolutely ethical in order to support its premium pricing strategy. And of course, interestingly, that it allows customers to use the QR code, to scan the QR code and to check where materials are coming from. Together with the blockchain technology, that this can't be changed, for example, or manipulated in some way. Another example is called Allbirds. It's a US company. Now, what it did is that it would directly sell its product or shoes to customers using its website and a small number of branded stores. I would say that by doing this, although we can copy that, okay, from our company's point of view. Now, the advantage of doing that is that you will get lots and lots of data from your customers. So I would expect, perhaps this time, about the pros and cons of the big data analytics. So, for example, that we can utilize the big data to predict what is going on. To predict what type of shoes and fashion or different types of customers would buy. Now, we can think about that. So, this is the market analysis. And that's all I can do. Just to recap, slower growth, but very, very strong and severe competition according to the 5 forces analysis according to your syllabus C3A. And even the evaluating opportunities, we've got plenty of those because we are thinking about to increase our volume of our sales. And that's all I can say. Right, okay then. Let's move on. In the production side, from our Preseen, page number 2, still, in our country, the shoes are produced in one of these 2 ways, either using mass production technique or they're using handcrafted. What do you think? Well, I would say that using mass production technique, we all know that we are spreading the fixed costs over the increasing number of shoes that we are producing to make sure that the total costs of each pair of shoe would reduce. However, what I would like to think about now is that I would like to bring the risk dynamic topic from the SBL syllabus D1F, because this topic was tested in the past. However, not many students did well on this topic, so let me explain. If you're using the way number 1, mass production technique, or using the way number 2, handcrafted, there would be areas may go wrong, which means risk happening. What do I mean by dynamics? Which means changing all the time. These risks are changing all the time, and how you would respond to it. From my perspective, firstly, I will look at from a supply chain point of view, which means that dealing with the suppliers and dealing with the retailers to sell our product. And of course, when we are using mass production technique in our company nowadays, that we've outsourced quite a few types of shoes production to the company called X company. We rely on a third-party supplier. And we also rely on the cross-border logistics. And this may causing a lot of delays. And even the quality being lowered down. And of course, from our first section analysis, that we know that when we are using mass production, it will eat up our cash and increasing our interest expense. And that would be another fixed cost that we will need to think about as the incremental fixed cost part. So I would say that the supply chain risk for mass production is quite high. So we will need to think about how to reduce that risk and to review the policies and procedures that we use in dealing with the supply chain issues more frequently, because the risk dynamic is quite high related to the supply chain risk. For handcrafted, on the other hand, I would say that because you've got this in-house, low supply chain risk. How about for reputation? If the supply chain risk is high, if the quality control risk is high, of course the reputation risk is high. Now the reputation risk not only related to, the delays, lowering your quality. Think about a business. Well, a lot of delays, which means a lot of costs, our margins are quite low. What the business could do is that it will subsequently lower the purchasing price of the raw materials. It may cause a lot of ethical concerns. If your product is quite profitable, for most businesses, they will not exploit the labor, for example. However, for struggling business, it will lead to other, I would say, the byproduct. For example, the ethical concerns, poor labor standards offshore, which means allowing the overseas manufacturers to produce your product. For the handcrafted products, on the other hand, I would say that possibly quite low. And especially that in our company, the formal shoes that we are using handcrafted way to protect the legacy, quite good. Right, how about for the volatility risk? Well, the purchasing price will be quite volatile because you are exposing yourself to volatile input costs related to oil price, related to geopolitics, for example, sometimes that you can't get the shoes because there will be wars happening elsewhere in the world. So therefore, I would like to come up with different ways to reduce our risk. For example, using audit. Making sure that stricter quality assurance audit, site inspections, and real-time tracking systems to make sure the items will come on time. Alternatively, we can avoid that risk. For example, instead of solely relying on the X company, why not working with another one? Why not bring some production back in-house? We can always transfer that risk. For example, within the contract, we can include penalties for late delivery or poor quality because we are currently relying on our ex-company. How about for the handcrafted way? Now, the ways that we can reduce that risk. So for example, we need lots of investment. For example, the training of our in-house skilled labor. We need to have machinery and IT systems in place in controlling the processes to run smoothly. So these are sort of things I would expect students to say if I'm the examining team member, although I'm not the examiner for the SBL paper. So making sure that you revise this topic quite well. Now, I would say that bringing the real life example here, let's see Hermes is a luxurious brand in France. Again, now, for these luxury companies, they will keep handcrafted product. Why? I mean, handcrafted product, the volume will be quite low. I mean, the margin will be quite high. But since because the volume is quite low, why do we keep them? One of the solid reasons behind it is to make sure that they avoid strategic risk. Now, such is the example that we've seen in Forever 21. Using cheap materials, absolutely fine now. Reducing costs, improving margin. However, this may not survive in the longer term. Because when we are keeping the handcrafted product in our business, to a certain extent, the competitors are very difficult to copy them. So that's why the business can last longer. So I would expect my student that for this particular case study, they will not simply jump into the conclusion that, right, formal shoes using in-house handcrafted ways, low volume, although a bit higher margin, dispose off this product line. But what I would say is that avoiding that strategic risk to a certain extent, helping a business last longer, I would highly recommend our company to keep the formal shoes line later on. Right, now moving on. We are now looking at either using mass production and handcrafted ways. Firstly, let's see the mass production way, involving the use of machines almost at all stages. All right, as we can see there, firstly, we cut it. But I'm not sure that if you're using machines or using human beings, but we're told from the Preseen that we are using machines, stitching, and lasting, which means mold it, just shape it, and then quality check, finishing, in other words. 4 steps in there. Now, firstly, I will say that in your syllabus, according to SBL syllabus H5B, you may be given some sort of strategic changes, and you will need to assess the implication to our Dearn business. Now, I always say to my students that when you're structuring your answer, always think about the XYZ relationship. Giving your point, explain further with details from the exhibit, and then considering the future as the Z step. Now, let me give you a few examples. Related to mass production, why not to think about partial reshoring of production related to lasting and finishing, which means the step 3 and step 4, the molding and quality check, and even puts the label called Make in Luckland on our own. Now, if this is the case, then as set up, well, firstly, I'm giving the point relocating back in our country. So, explain one step further, because these stages is important in relation to quality and in relation to brand visibility. So explain one step further. However, what will be the next step? The set step. This may incur higher costs and retraining cost and time. So that will be the risk or the downside that we need to consider. So it's just to be the balance argument, not just to be the good side, but also the bad side. We can talk about that. Another strategic change is that instead of relying on the X company, but now relying on the X and Y company, which means dual or double sourcing. Now, the X point is that we currently rely on X. However, the Y is that it may give competitive pressure. It will also work with Y. However, the downside is that it may take time. For example, you need to check the supplier Y before it is on board. Another change, well, we can upgrade our automation for the step number 1. So you can read my illustration there. I would say that that's the first thing I would like to think about related to the strategic change options, where you're required to assess each of those in turn per your syllabus. Now, what's more important is this. In real life, that we've got the company that we've seen before, the French brand called Wedger. Now, Wedger did outsource its production somewhere else, in other parts of a factory. However, it's not just outsourcing, because we all know that the downside of outsourcing is that we can't control the quality. And this is why it is partnering with the factory when the factory makes shoes on its behalf. Now, what it did is that it will send its own team, not just technical staff, but people trained in sustainability and operations, to work with the factory supervisors and workers. Now, what they did is that they co-developed the standardized procedure, holding training sections on how to reduce water and reducing glue waste, and even bringing in external partners to help business qualify for environmental certifications. Now, as we can see there, because I work with you, I outsource my production to you, in other words, I'm your customer, we need to sign the agreement so we can build in the partnership part within that agreement in order that you can sell your product to me. So that's the way that we can think about this. So that's according to the syllabus C5F, assess how internal development, business combinations, strategic alliances here is related to outsourcing and combining with the partnering, which means the partnership, to achieve business growth. So make sure that we are ready for that. Right there. Now, before I move on to the next part, I would like to stop the second section recording now and look forward to seeing you soon in other parts of our Preseen application, where I'm trying my best to recap on the syllabus areas or the most important syllabus areas or the majority of those, so you can well prepare for this Preseen material in the upcoming sitting exam. I look forward to seeing you soon then. Bye.
APC, accounting for your future.